16 and Away from Home by Arleta Richardson. Chapter 15. A Friend is Forever. May 31st, 1890. The school year is almost over and we'll be going home for the summer. SJ's aunt and uncle have written to say that we must come back next year so they can enjoy having us here. I can't think of anything that would make us want to miss our last year. The Lord has been good to give us such an opportunity.
2 more weeks,
Sarah Jane announced as we slid into our places at breakfast.
1 week of classes and 1 week of exams, then graduation. Next year at this time, you'll be graduating,
Letty said.
How the days fly by.
That's a whole year away, Letty, I said. It seems like forever to me.
It won't when you're my age,
she replied.
But I'm glad you think so. I'm looking forward to your coming again in the fall.
So are we, I told her. A summer at home looks pretty good, but I know I'll be glad to get back to school.
Isn't this the day of the honor assembly?
Jacob asked. I nodded.
We have half a day of classes and then we go back at 2 o'clock for the assembly. That means we'll be home for dinner this noon.
Letty looked dismayed.
Oh dear, I forgot all about that. Jacob and I have some business to take care of and we won't be back until the middle of the afternoon. Don't worry about us, Letty, Sarah Jane said. We can get our own dinner.
Letty was relieved.
We'll be back in plenty of time for supper. I'll put a pot of beans in the oven this morning. Since you'll be here, would you mind taking them out just before you leave for the assembly? Just put them on the back of the stove to stay warm.
Sure, I said. We'll do that.
You'd better let me remember it,
Sarah Jane told me.
I'd just as soon not have burned beans tonight.
Before I could reply, Jacob asked about the awards.
How many are you two getting?
We're each getting a Scholastic Award, I answered. And I'm getting one for speech.
And I'll receive a perfect attendance certificate,
Sarah Jane added.
I haven't been tardy or missed a class all year.
That's a good record, Letty said. If it hadn't been for Mabel's accident, she'd have had one too.
You're going to lose that one today if we don't get started, I said. Look what time it is.
We grabbed our books and rushed out the door.
Why were you so slow this morning?
Sarah Jane asked.
We didn't even get to have prayer before we left. Now we'll be rushed all day long.
Jacob will pray for us, I said. And I wasn't any slower than you were. Who had to go back upstairs to get her notebook?
Don't act so superior, Mabel,
Sarah Jane said crossly.
You forget 10 things while I'm forgetting one. You're the person with your head in the clouds and your nose in a book.
We arrived in our classroom just seconds before the bell rang.
I can't believe the luxury of having 2 hours for noon recess,
Molly said as we walked to our second period class.
Why don't you come home with me for dinner?
We could do that,
Sarah Jane said.
Letty and Jacob are gone. We were going to have to get our own.
That would be fun,
I agreed.
Are your folks coming for the assembly? Mama will,
Molly replied, but Papa has office hours. She gave a sigh.
I hope he can get away from his patients long enough to come and see me graduate next year. Don't worry, I said. He wouldn't miss that. I guess there's an advantage to being a farmer's daughter. Pa never misses anything at school that we had a part in.
I felt a sudden twinge of longing for my home and the familiar faces of Ma and Pa. At that moment, 2 weeks seemed longer than the rest of the year had been. History class turned into a study period since Mr. Kingman was busy preparing for the assembly.
It's too bad you won't have anyone here to see you get your awards, Clarice said to me. You've certainly worked hard for them. They'll be thinking about me, I replied, and they'll get to see them when I get home. The biggest award I have is a truce with you, I added silently. That's worth more than all the rest put together.
Mrs. Matson welcomed us at dinner time. We'll miss you girls this summer, she said. Molly has been happier this year than she's ever been in school.
We were hoping Molly could come and spend some time with us this summer, Sarah Jane said. Do you think she could?
I don't see why not if your parents won't mind, Mrs. Matson replied. Maybe that will help her live through the vacation. We finished dinner and went to sit on the porch until time to go back to school. While the girls were talking, I thought about the beans in the oven at home. I opened my mouth to remind Sarah Jane, but then thought again.
She was so uppity about my forgetting, I thought. I'll wait and see how good her memory is.
At just that moment, the boys came around the house.
"We thought we'd find you here," Thomas said. "Are you all ready to pick up your honors?"
Warren chimed in.
"Too bad you couldn't quite add the math award to your list, Mabel. But never mind, you'll probably only have to teach the first 8 grades.
Warren,
I said.
If I hadn't known you since we were born, I'd probably dislike you intensely.
I'm just teasing, he replied. Actually, Mabel, you have a pretty good brain. For a girl. I glared at him and Russ laughed. You'd better back off, Warren. You're going to be chewing shoe leather in a minute.
Mrs. Madsen came to the door. It's about time for you to get started, she said. Are you going directly to the assembly? We have to report to our study room and go with the class, Molly answered. But you get there early so you'll have a good seat. We strolled back to school, enjoying the lovely spring day. Shortly after 2 o'clock, we were dismissed to go to the assembly room. Molly and I walked together.
Where's Sarah Jane?
I wondered. She went out ahead of us, Molly said. She's probably saving us a seat. The room seemed full of visitors when we entered, and I looked around to see whom I might know. Near the back, I spied Jacob and Letty.
Oh, look, Molly,
I said.
They came to be our family. Wasn't that sweet?
Molly hurried me toward the front where the students were sitting. We couldn't see Sarah Jane anywhere, so we found 2 vacant places and sat down. The program was just ready to begin when things clicked together in my brain.
Oh, no,
I cried.
The beans!
People around me looked at me strangely as I started to get up. Molly pulled me down.
You can't leave now,
she whispered.
Mr. Kingman is starting to speak.
I sank into my seat with a moan. Why hadn't I reminded Sarah Jane when I thought of it? This time, my stubbornness was going to affect everyone. Supper would be ruined and Sarah Jane would feel awful. I'd have to tell her how sorry I was, but that wouldn't save the beans. Through my tumbled thoughts, I heard Mr. Kingman calling people's names and saw them go forward. Then he said, Now we have come to the most important certificate. We place great emphasis on steady attendance and punctuality. I am always pleased when we have a group of students who have maintained a perfect record. Will these pupils please come for their award? Catherine Borden?
Now we'll see where she's sitting, Molly whispered. She's next.
Sarah Jane Clark,
Mr. Kingman said. There was silence.
Sarah Jane?
Mr. Kingman peered around the room.
She wouldn't be absent when she's about to get a perfect attendance award, would she?
People snickered and looked around. I grabbed Molly's arm frantically.
Where is she? Didn't you see her leave the room?
Yes, and I thought she was coming here.
Where would she have gone?
I was beginning to think I knew, and I felt worse than ever. She had suddenly remembered the beans in the oven and had gone home to take them out. Mr. Kingman was going on with the list. When he had finished, he looked around the room again.
Is Sarah Jane Clark here now?
He asked.
Yes, sir,
came a voice from the doorway, and Sarah Jane hurried down the aisle. Her face was flushed, and her usually neat hair was hanging in little wisps around her face, and she was breathing heavily.
I'm sure whatever kept you was unavoidable,
Mr. Kingman said kindly.
Here is your certificate.
He shook her hand, and Sarah Jane sat down on the other side of the room.
Oh, I could just die,
I said.
To think I'd do a thing like that to my best friend.
What did you do? Molly asked in bewilderment. And where has she been? What's this all about?
I'll tell you later,
I said.
That is, if I live long enough.
The assembly didn't last a lot longer, but I could have waited the rest of the afternoon before having to face Sarah Jane. We found her waiting in the hallway when we were dismissed.
I always say if you're going to make a spectacle of yourself, be sure to have a good audience, she announced cheerfully. I ran all the way home and all the way back in just under 10 minutes. And I'll never say anything about your memory again, Mabel. If I hadn't seen Letty when I walked in here, I'd never have thought of those beans the rest of the day. I'm glad you girls are so good-natured, Jacob said when we told them what had happened. I'd hate to see a pot of beans break up a friendship like yours. Never, Sarah Jane said. We've gone through a lot of outrageous things together, but none of them has ever changed the way we feel about each other. I'd never lived without Mabel. Would you want me to start now? After all, a friend is forever. Jacob and Letty laughed and agreed, and I quietly thanked the Lord for a good friend like Sarah Jane. She was right. Life would not be the same without her.
End of chapter 15. End of 16 and Away from Home.